You're listening to episode 66. Katie talks with a rare disease mom about how to support siblings of children with medical needs. Hi, and welcome to the Child Life On Call podcast. When your child is sick, the whole world seems to stop in its tracks. Plans and priorities change, and your number one job becomes figuring out how to get your child well again. For some of us, rest, medications, and relaxation can do the trick. But for others, it takes more. It takes countless doctor appointments, invasive medical testing, therapies, surgeries, the list goes on, and then you still may not have all of the answers or results you were hoping for. This podcast features parents of children that have an illness or medical condition and gives them a place to share their own journeys and experiences. We will talk about the ups and the downs, the highs and the lows, but one thing seems to remain the same. Children are resilient and teach us more about ourselves and the world than we could ever imagine. Thank you so much for lending a listening ear and opening up your heart to these families and this podcast. I'm your host, Katie Taylor.
That was a big question people had, was knowing when the best time is to have another child after this child with all these medical needs.
Hello, my wonderful friends. I hope that you are doing well, and I'm very excited about this episode today. So, okay, just stick with me here for a second. This is a Child Life On Call episode of an episode that I did on the Rare Life podcast with Madeline. So I'm basically playing a conversation I had with her on her podcast on my podcast. Totally makes sense, right? Well, here's why we did it. Back in episode 62, I got to interview Madeline, and she is the host of the Rare Life podcast. In that podcast, she talks about her personal experiences of having a child with rare disease and has other experts and parents on to talk. So if you haven't already, definitely go listen to her podcast now. And if you haven't listened to our previous conversation in episode 62 on Child Life on Call, Madeline and I talk about her son, Kimball. But what you're going to hear today is my conversation on her podcast, in which we talk about her daughter, Wendy. So often, rightfully so, the conversations are about the child who is going through a medical condition or a hospitalization or has just received a new diagnosis or is having some different appointments or has a rare disease. But what about the other siblings, the other people living in the home who are walking alongside it with you? I'm so excited for you to hear our conversation today, and I hope that you feel like you want to share it with others to think about the sibling consideration and what they actually go through as well.
Hi, Katie. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yes, I'm super excited to talk about our children's siblings because I feel like, that is a huge part of our lives with disability and medical issues, is helping our child's siblings through it all too. And I have I've had a really hard time with my older daughter, Wendy, helping her through this. And so I am really excited to learn right along with our audience some ways to support them and help them through this crazy journey. So let's start out with talking about how to educate our children's siblings about some pretty mature, difficult topics. What would you
Yeah.
have to advise us on that?
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. And I'm excited to talk to your listeners who are just seem to be so engaged with you and asked such good questions leading up to this episode that I hope I do it justice and give you some nuggets.
Yeah.
What we learn in Child Life School 101 is that when you have a patient, you not only have the patient, you have the entire family. And as child life specialists, we really look at siblings and how they're affected. And that's always part of our assessment when we're going in to meet families. So I'm so excited to talk about this today because siblings definitely matter and they affect the hospitalization, whether they're there or not, the child, whether
Yeah.
they're there or not.
Yeah.
So, this is kind of the boring part, but I think it's really important to understand a little bit of development when you're thinking about how do I talk to my child about hard things. And the
Mm,
reason for that is that we do go through different developmental phases, right? So, children are not miniature adults, they don't process the same way we do, they process in their own way.
mm,
So, just very quickly, I want to go through just kind of development 101, talking about infant to toddlers. If you have an infant or
mm,
a toddler as a sibling, their world is incredibly egocentric. And so, what that means
mm.
is literally everything is what's happening to them in their world. And they have no perception on how you may feel, or baby may feel, or big sibling may feel. It is
Right.
totally about them. So you've kind of seen, the look on parents' faces when a toddler takes a ball and throws it at a newborn baby and they're like, "Oh
Yeah.
my gosh." But that's just to see what your reaction is going to be for that. It's going to see, what does the ball feel like when it leaves my hand to me? What does the baby do? What does that make me feel?
Hmm.
It's totally just about them. So that's
Mm.
important to keep in mind. Moving on
Interesting.
up to preschool and kind of that early school age is really where magical thinking starts to play in. And I
Mm.
bring that up only because some of the medical language we can use can be really misleading. One of the
Oh.
famous ones we talk about is a CAT scan. So you think about,
Oh
like,
my
there's no
gosh.
cats in the CAT scan, but
Yeah.
for a magical thinking kiddo, there could totally be cats there.
Yeah.
Um,
That's
Kind of a
cute.
personal story. I have a 5-year-old right now, and he is in the past like 4 out of 5 nights has come downstairs at 2 a.m. and said, "Are killer bees going to get me?" Or, it's just
Oh,
his brain is going. And
right.
so that's where that stage is. Um,
Mm.
and I was preparing a kiddo for a surgery once. He was having an appendectomy, and he asked if the doctor was going to use his Jedi laser or his safety scissors
Oh
to
my
take his appendix
gosh.
out,
Oh,
right?
so cute.
It's so cute. It's like totally his experience. That's what he knows.
Yes. Oh my gosh. But yeah, that's a great example of that.
Yeah. And then just moving up to the older school age and the adolescence, which I can kind of group together because they're very similar in going through this. It's called industry versus inferiority. Like, who am I in this world? Am I
Mm,
the brother of a special needs child? Am I the basketball player? Am I the favorite? Am I
mm,
a good friend? Am I the bully? So they're just very obsessed with where they fit in their world. And so the reason I want to get this kind of out there is so that you can think about the siblings that we're talking about today and think about where would they fall within this kind of loose timeline and these loose
mm,
phases. So when we're thinking about talking to them, you
right.
keep that in mind.
Yeah, that seems super important because as you're talking, I'm thinking about Wendy when Kimball was first born because she was in that 0 to 2,
Yeah.
and then how it has evolved since she's gone more into the preschool age. That's super
Hmm.
interesting.
Yeah. Does she have any experiences that pop out to you that are kind of like match either that magical thinking or that toddler aggression?
Well, Wendy is super aggressive. Like, I think that's
Yeah.
also just part of her nature that I probably handed down to her. So it's my
Yeah.
fault. But like, there was a lot of physical, a lot of hurting, a lot of attacking of Kimball. And
Mm.
so, it's interesting where she definitely was going for a reaction, but it was hurtful to watch because I saw other siblings, other children her age, cuddling their baby
Uh,
sibling and like, oh, they love them too much. I need to make sure they don't snuggle them too much. And I
oh,
was like,
yeah.
like dagger in the heart. Like, I wish that were my problem. But
Oh,
yeah.
gosh. I bet they were probably like secretly snuggling a little too hard on purpose. It wasn't all
Yeah.
just for the loving feelings, right? It
Yeah.
was to get the reaction too.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point because
Yeah.
it's easy to look at those perfect little squares on Instagram and be like,
Oh,
"Well,
yeah.
their life is perfect."
Yep. No, it's not. Promise.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
So that kind of gets into the explaining medical complexities. And when we're dealing with kiddos who have a lot of chronic issues, the best thing to do is almost break it down by system and to keep it
Mm,
really, really simple. So, you think about the job of the brain. The job of the brain is to tell you to talk, to walk, to breathe, to eat, to swallow, to do all of those things we don't have to think about, to feel, to
mm,
love. And so those are all feelings and words that kids know. And so
right.
when you talk about the brain, we don't have to get into the neuroscience and the DNA and the
Yeah.
cells, but we can talk about the job of the brain.
Yeah.
The same thing goes for the heart. We can be as complex as we want to be, or we can break it down really simply. The air
Mm.
we breathe into our lungs gets pumped into our heart, and then that shoots blood to the rest of our body, and it just goes on and on and on. And that's the job of our heart. And your
Right.
sister's heart isn't working on one of the sides. It's called the left side. Do you know which side is your left side? So you can you're just
Mm.
breaking it down as simple as possible.
Right.
Um, and one of the rules of thumb when talking with kiddos is they generally are going to ask the questions they want to know the answers to. And they're
Mm.
not going to ask the questions that they don't want to hear.
Right.
So, in that way, kids really can lead the conversation. So, I can kind of go back to that
Mm.
kiddo who asked me about the Jedi laser or the safety scissors, and
Mhm.
he really wanted to go there. Like, he wanted to
Yeah.
visualize his appendix coming out of his body. Not every kid wants to do that.
That's a good point.
Um, and so when I'm talking to him and he says, "Well, how is he going to take it out?" And I said, "Well, what do you think?" And I love that question because it puts it back on them and we can understand their frame of reference. So he
Mm.
told me what he thought, and I thought, you know what? Wouldn't that be kind of cool if that is what he used? But it's not. The doctor actually has a special set of tools, and there's one that's especially made for taking out an appendix, and that's the one he's going to use. That was the
Mm.
simplest answer, and he was totally fine with that.
Right.
I
Yeah.
didn't have to go into like he's going to cut you open, he's going to, all of those things. But
Yeah.
I gave him the answer that he wanted and felt good for him. And we got to end the conversation there. And that was good.
Yeah. Yeah, that kind of even reminds me, not even with vocal communication, but when Wendy first met her brother in the NICU, we brought her in there and she was really holding back. Like she was just kind of looking at him side eye. And we had expected her to, we pictured like this big reunion of like, oh my gosh, it's my
Yeah.
brother and kisses and hugs. But she was really holding back. And so looking back, I think I pushed her too much. Like, hey, Wendy, like give him a kiss or, do you want to
Hmm.
touch him? But her body language was saying, no, I want to hold back. And I just kind of want to look at him from afar and all these tubes and all these machines and just all of
Yeah.
it. So,
I think there's a healthy balance there. It's the
mm,
showing you it's safe to kiss, it's safe to hold. These are things you can do. And then
mm,
kind of like watching her step back too and be like, that's an okay choice too.
yeah.
In those scenarios, I love giving kiddos a safe word. So sometimes kids can go into a really hard situation and they don't know how to ask to get out of it.
Oh,
So I can give you an example of if I were to bring a child in to say a goodbye visit to a grandparent or a loved one.
mm-hmm.
It can be really important for the adults in the room for this child to say their goodbyes. But for the child, it may be something they want to do, but it's okay to give them, if you get tired of being in there, why don't you either cough into your elbow or say, I have to use the bathroom or say pineapple or
Mm,
whatever you want the word to be. And
mm-hmm.
then that's the sign that I know or the safe another adult in the room knows that you're done being in there. You just don't want to say it out loud. So you
Yeah.
you kind of come up with this plan beforehand so that when you get in that situation, they have a way out if they're done.
Yeah. And that probably goes for a lot of difficult situations, really traumatic situations, emergency hospitalizations, and
Yeah.
just really scary stuff to watch.
Yeah. And also taking pictures ahead of time whenever you're able to do that, just so when they walk into the room, they're not blindsided. And you
Mm,
can take pictures of everything that you want to, or you can help cover up the hospitalized patient, or you can take a picture of even this is what the sink looks like we wash our hands at. So, put a
mm-hmm.
little bit of normalcy in there mixed in with some of the more complex stuff that's harder to understand. They could
Yeah.
walk in and be like, oh, that's the picture of the chair you showed me. And you're like, that's what you see.
Yeah.
But, that's for them, that's comfortable, that's normal. And then that kind of
Mm,
helps them feel normal too and a little bit more comfortable.
yeah, that totally makes sense. And kind of building off of that
Yeah.
familiarity.
Yeah. And another thing I just want to bring up is that I'm a big fan of the sit down family meeting for as
Mm,
casual as it needs to be, because I think that's when you get through a lot of the bulk of the plans, the what's it feel like, the asking questions. And it's kind of just this open forum of this is a safe space to talk about this. This is when we're doing this. That doesn't mean the
mm,
conversation's over when we all get up and leave, but
mm-hmm.
it means that you can continue asking questions and we can come back and do this again.
So tell me more about that. So, a family meeting.
It doesn't have to be formal, but what I like is especially when there needs to be a serious conversation or you're
Mm,
just noticing something is different, or maybe there's another surgery coming up for the sibling the next week, or you just want to get them engaged. And so
mhm,
be like, hey, we're gonna all sit down as a family and we're all going to be able to ask questions and talk about what's
mm,
happening next week with our sibling. And so in
yeah,
that, you could kind of think about that development stuff we talked about at the beginning and think, what's the
mhm,
most basic, plain way I can say this? And then how can I get this sibling involved? And something simple as, would you be able to help me pack a bag of some things you think they may like before the surgery? I know we can't
mm,
go in together, but you know what their favorite book is, the blanket that needs to go in there, or
mhm,
what's something I can remember to tell the nurse or the doctor, and kind of look at
mhm,
them and what they're able to bring to the table. And then
yeah,
that way that family meeting and conversation has happened. So the night before, rather than being stressed and sensing that parents are stressed and something's going on, they've got their job of what
mhm,
they've planned to do for that
yeah,
night and they know what to expect the next day.
yeah. I think that might be like this innate instinct, I don't know, of children to, at least at Wendy's age now, she didn't do this before, but to want to be helpful, because I was
Yeah.
telling her about her brother. We almost did a surgery, a major surgery, where he'd need to be in the hospital for 5 days for recovery. And I told her how she wouldn't be able to go because of COVID precautions. And she was planning out what we would do when he got home,
Oh,
like all his favorite foods and just different toys that he loves, and it would be a surprise for him. And she just went on and on about these things she was planning, and I was like dying inside because that's a part of their relationship that was not always there. But it's
yeah.
interesting because I didn't think to give her a job, but she took initiative to give herself a job, and
I
that was
love
probably
that.
a coping mechanism to get to work and feel
I
part of it.
mean, that's pretty amazing, that she was able to come up with that, and I think
Mm,
you're not giving yourself enough credit because she breeds off of you, right? So she sees
mm.
what you do to get ready for something, and so she's trying to mirror that as well.
I
So,
do,
well
yeah.
done.
I do a lot of self comfort things, like, oh, I had a rough day. Let's go watch a movie. So maybe,
Yes,
maybe
exactly.
she's looking at that. That's
The
how we handle
balance.
hard things.
I love it. I love that.
um. So one of my listeners' questions was about how to help siblings who witness their special needs sibling being bullied, and I thought that was a really good question. I hadn't really thought of. I thought of bullying, but not in that way. How would you suggest handling that?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, a very good question because well, let's take it back to the development. And I would
Mm,
assume that a child who can be embarrassed by bullying is probably in that school age to older school age, right? So they're kind
right.
of wrestling with this who am I, where do I fit in kind of phase. And so when the special needs sibling is being bullied, what is that bringing up for the sibling? Are they
Mm,
saying, I'm different because I have a special needs sibling? Are they saying,
mhm,
I'm different because I look different than my sibling? It kind of goes back to the why is my sibling different? And I think
mm,
when you talk about it in a basic way and they understand at their age level what the medical complexity is, it's easier to understand the why. And so this is getting confusing.
mm,
A good example is I just had Shay on my podcast, and her daughter has Klippel-Trenaunay syndrome. It's a vascular malformation that makes her hand look larger than normal, and it's very obvious
mm,
to see. So when she's at the playground and a kiddo comes up to her and sometimes is not bullying but is just
mm,
inquisitive and asking questions, it really puts a damper on her experience at the playground,
mm.
and it puts a damper on her siblings experience at the playground because they see that she gets upset.
Oh.
And so rather than going to talk to the bully or to the kid who is asking the question, it's about finding the connection between the sibling and the sibling that is different. So the sibling that is witnessing the bullying can go then make a connection and make sure that they're doing okay. Because we know that we're
Mm,
not going to get anywhere with a bully, right?
mhm.
We know that a bully is usually being bullied.
Right.
So going in and attacking or speaking back to is just going to make us more upset. What is going
Mhm,
to strengthen that family is the sibling and the sibling connecting together or connecting
mm,
with the parent and talking about what's happening. Shay says in the episode, I don't think that 6-year-old would know what vascular malformation is or be able to understand what it is. So I'm not going to talk about it with them right now. And I just
Yeah.
love that approach, like what if we said that to the bully? Like, do you know what vascular malformation is? No, and
Yeah.
but we do, and we
Mm,
know what a medical complexity is. So
right.
rather than looking at it as like, what do we do when we're bullied? It's how do we support each other when that happens?
Mm. I love that because I also picture it being this bonding opportunity. Like we're banding together. Don't you mess with my brother. Come here. Let's go, talk about it
Totally.
and have
Yeah.
that defensive mama bear or sister bear, brother bear, whatever feeling.
Yeah. And opening up the conversation of like, okay, what do we do as a family? What is our response? Do we
Yeah.
say, do you know what vascular malformation is? Or do we simply keep going on with what we want to do? Or do we take a break and then get back out there? You just come up
Yeah.
with what fits. And rather than focusing on the bully, and it does hurt and it's normal to feel hurt by those things.
Hmm.
It's strengthening that bond, just like you said.
Yeah. Yeah, that is great. And it probably fosters a lot of empathy for you to say, hey, he's probably being bullied, like you said. Let's not mess with him. Let's talk about it over here. I feel like that's a really great concept to think about. Like, people who are being mean to me are probably hurting inside too. And
Totally.
so, yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of the normal thing. Bulliers are bullying because that's how they've been treated. And
Yeah.
if I were a bully and I were mean to someone and I saw someone else come up and show them compassion and even have more fun, that is actually more of a knife in the heart, right? Than actually the words
Yeah.
hurting them, is
Yeah.
actually being, oh, my words don't affect you as much as I thought. You have a very strong relationship together.
Yeah. Yeah, that is awesome. Okay, so moving on, a huge part, I think, of siblings struggling are all of the difficult emotions that they handled right along with us. We have these really hard things we're going through, and so do they. And I don't know, a few of those that I have noticed in our family, and then a few of the listeners have talked about in their questions are things like resentment for lack of attention, because that child usually gets a lot of extra attention,
Hmm.
embarrassment of the sibling, which is a touchy one, witnessing trauma, and dealing with hospitalizations and appointments and just all of it. How do you
Yeah.
help them deal with those emotions?
Gosh, I know. That's a loaded question, Madeline.
Tell us like the secret answer. We need
Okay,
to have this.
here's the sauce. No, okay, the sauce, I stick with these two words, and that's validating and vulnerability.
Hmm.
And what that is validating whatever emotion they are sharing with you. Okay. Because
Hmm.
what we want is for our kids to be able to name the feelings and emotions they're having and verbally express them. Okay. We don't want them to keep them
Hmm.
inside, bottle up, and that resentment just keeps on going. Right.
Yeah.
So when a child is saying, you always go to him first when he needs something, or you're
Hmm.
always going to doctor's appointments, you never have time for me, rather than saying, well, he needs me more, or
Hmm.
and sometimes these words can just come out, right? Because
Yeah.
literally and physically this child does need you more.
Right.
But instead of just going there straight away, one of my favorite books by Dan Siegel is No Drama Discipline, and he talks about chasing the
Hmm.
why. So it's like, why is this happening? They're not trying to get mad at their other sibling, but that's where it's coming out at.
Right.
That's where that resentment is going. They're just feeling left out themselves. So, just
Yeah.
taking a second to say, I get it, buddy. This is not easy for you. And you know what? Mommy actually was hoping to go take a shower, and I don't get to do that either. So I totally see where you're coming from.
Yeah.
And that's kind of that validating and then the vulnerability of sharing something that's within you. I
Hmm.
think as adults, we can be really scared to cry in front of our kids or break down. But when I'm working with families in the hospital, this is likely one of or the most difficult experience they're going to have. And
Yeah.
so when they cry in front of their kids or their loved ones or their other kiddos, or they cry on FaceTime or whatever it is, they're showing that this is incredibly hard and I get to cry and I get to go through
Hmm.
it. And in turn, that makes children feel like when I'm upset, I get to cry too. I don't
Yeah.
have to hold it back.
Yeah.
So, but that is hard. And it is a balance of, not completely losing yourself and falling on the floor and cursing and kind of demonstrating that behavior. But
Right.
sobbing when you're upset can be a release.
Hmm.
And showing that to kids is incredibly courageous and then in turn allows them to feel the same way.
Yeah. So I have a question for you, kind of a
Yeah.
tangent. And
Yeah.
maybe this is unique. I don't know if this is a normal thing, but when Wendy was in that 2 to 3 year age range, and I would have an emotional moment and I would be crying about it, she would hit me. She would come up to me
Mhm.
and become aggressive and be like, "Stop crying." And I was like, "What the heck?" And I felt like this like this ultimate like pity party like of me
Yes.
crying and my
Yeah.
toddler hitting me. How would
Yeah.
you what do you think was happening there?
So I have a similar moment, except instead of the hitting, my toddler laughs at me. Okay.
Oh
So like
my
legit,
gosh.
like looks me dead in the eyes and like laughs like this is funny. So
Oh, owie.
it's not being able to process what's happening and what's seeing. And it's just
Mm,
coming out in a certain way.
okay.
And so in
Mhm.
that instance, if I were being hit, I would say, "That really hurts, mommy. I need to go take a break. I wanna be by myself right now." And you just
Yeah.
remove yourself,
Yeah.
and the same thing when my daughter looks me dead in the eye while I'm crying and laughs at me.
Yeah.
I'm like, "That doesn't feel good to me when you're laughing when I'm feeling sad.
Mm,
I'm feeling really sad right now, and that's why I'm crying." It's
mm,
it's there's no secret sauce other than just naming what you're seeing
mhm.
and continuing to be vulnerable yourself and also explain what you're going to do to get through it, right? you're
Right.
you're making me feel upset, so I'm going to leave. I'm going to go take a minute to myself.
Yeah.
Like, I'm allowed to do that.
Yeah, and that boundary setting is again a great example to them because they can see if someone is being disrespectful to me, I can tell them that's not okay and I'm going to
Mhm.
leave. That's just
Yeah.
a great opportunity to model a lot of different things.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to touch on really quickly is there are some sibling camps. And so, go to
Mm.
Google, look up sibling camps in your area for siblings of kids with special needs. There are programs that are designed just for them. There's something called Teleplay through Project Sunshine, and that's when a
Oh,
child is hospitalized, they can log on and play a game. A sibling at home can join in virtually too. So they're playing
oh,
a game through this volunteer organization.
that's
Um,
awesome.
and then one last quick story from the podcast is a woman, mom named Susan. She was sharing her story about her son who was diagnosed with Crohn's disease at 5 years old, which is incredibly young.
Oh,
And he has a twin brother who does not have Crohn's disease.
okay.
And so, one of the worst things for Crohn's is actually eating popcorn. And that's incredibly hard for their family because popcorn is their go to snack. And so, there
Oh,
was so much resentment for not being able to have popcorn in the house anymore and not being able to eat it when you go to the movies all together.
yeah.
And that was just a huge buildup for them. And so Susan just validated it and was like, "You know what, buddy? I really like popcorn too. And I'm just not going to have it in the house. It's too hard. It's too hard for your brother. And I get that that really stinks, but that's just something that we're not going to do." She kind of just had to draw the line.
Hmm.
So I don't know if it was months or a year later, they go to Disney World. They're walking down the street. It was just the not sick twin and the mom. And
Oh,
she's like,
okay.
"You know what, buddy? It's you and me right now. There's popcorn right there. Let's go get some." And
Mm.
the brother said, "You know what? I don't need it. I don't even want popcorn anymore. It makes my
Hmm.
brother upset and I don't even want it."
Wow.
Pretty
Wow.
amazing,
Yeah.
right? It's like,
Yeah.
it's just something to get mad at. It's something to resent. And then when it
Mm.
gets the time to settle in, gosh, kids are so resilient and they
Yeah.
freaking show up.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
she was like, "No, eat popcorn. Just do it."
Like, actually, I want popcorn.
Yeah, exactly.
That
Yeah.
is awesome. Yeah, like just even things like appointments. We used to drag Wendy around with us and that just became normal life. And then now with COVID, she hasn't been to an appointment with us for a year. And so
Mhm.
that has been really interesting because she's super bummed when we leave her now.
Yeah.
But that's been her life. And so yeah, kids are just so resilient. Like, it was a painful process to get to that point, but that's the world she knows and she
Yeah.
she rocks it. So,
It's almost like the ritual of it, right? You get used to what you get used to, and then
yeah.
when that changes, it's hard to adjust, and I think
Yeah.
that that goes a lot for kiddos too, and
Yeah.
I'm always just the biggest fan of therapy for kiddos, whether it's play therapy or especially
Mm,
siblings too, and just getting somebody involved. And if you don't know who to turn to, I love talking to your pediatrician, right? Because you usually go
mm,
and you focus on the child with special needs or medical complexities.
right.
But I think it's also important when you go in for those well checks with your well kids to just talk about, I have some concerns and what should I be looking out for? Or,
Mm.
what is your thought on a professional, and just really use your pediatrician for that well child too.
Oh, that's a great idea because that is something that we have entertained many times. Like, at what
Hmm.
point is this a unhealthy response? And I think looking back, we should have done therapy before. It's one of those things where it's like, do you put a 3-year-old in counseling? It kind of feels like this a very foreign concept, but that is just a great tool, I think, for adults. And why wouldn't it be for kids?
Oh, totally. Well, I love that it's just so normalized now, and mental health is
Yeah.
health, and that goes for kids too.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's a sad statistic about the increase in anxiety and um, just different things with kids. And so, why not? And I think
Hmm.
a pediatrician is a good sounding board
Okay.
for that conversation.
Okay. That's great. So, a pediatrician, and you talk to them about
Mhm.
just different things that they're dealing with and their responses. And
Yeah. And also the child's school counselor and
okay.
principal, and keeping them aware, sending an email to the teacher and saying, hey, sibling has a big surgery next week. If you notice anything different, would you please let me know? They may need
Mm,
you more than normal. Just keeping all the safe adults on board and on track,
yeah.
looking out for this sibling.
Yeah. I really love that because, you think it's just an interesting thing where it's your sick child. That's the person you're always on the lookout for,
Hmm.
physically.
You have to
And
be.
so
Yeah,
yeah, so I think it's easy to overlook, hey, this surgery will be difficult not only for the child having the surgery, but for their sibling as well. And I think that's a great thing to be
definitely.
aware of.
Yeah, I love that.
So, kind of changing gears a little bit, for those who are listening who contemplate adding children to their family and giving their child siblings or more siblings, that was a big question people had, was knowing when the best time is to have another child after this child with all these medical needs.
Hmm. I think it's more about how you, the parent, are doing and less about the age of the child. I
Mm,
think that as a parent, you can get to that moment where you're like, I can handle more, or I can't
mhm.
handle more. And so that for some people could be a year, that could be 3 years, it could be 10 years.
Yeah.
And you don't want to just go by, 2.7 years is the optimal time to
Yeah.
have children apart, because who knows what 2.7 years in a medically complex child's life looks like. It probably
Yeah.
feels more like 10 years, right? So
Yeah.
then reevaluating at 5 years. We've talked about this many times in this podcast. Children are resilient, and there
Mm,
is no age or phase that they aren't going to be able to handle what comes at them, as long as you
mm,
have the support and resources and tools on deck to be able to do it. So, less about
mhm,
how old the child is, more about how you, the parent, what does your team, what does your partnership look like? What does your balancing look like? Is the
mhm,
child in school full time, so that actually frees up? So
mhm,
it's thinking about that. And also
mm,
the resources I'm talking about, for this next baby, get really good at baby sleep, right? So, because when
mhm,
babies sleep well, parents sleep better, you're able to
mhm,
handle more. So, there's
mhm.
great resources out there. My favorite one is Taking Care of Babies. I think she's just full of light. It's online virtual lessons, and she is
Oh,
so amazing. I
awesome.
think it's like getting meal trains on board when the baby is born, and setting that cooler outside of your house and having people drop off food to the
Mm,
cooler, not to you. Um,
interesting.
and if you do decide to have the baby, like, use all your resource, get really good at baby sleep, get meals
Mhm,
provided for you, find out
mhm.
who's going to help you. And then I think, best when the best time is.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that preparation is so important because it can allow you to do things that you may feel like you couldn't otherwise. Like you say, like with the sleep and having others help you and getting people on board and recognizing, like, hey, having a child after or additionally to a child with medical needs is going to be extra hard, just like everything else
Mhm.
is, because
Right.
they take so much more time and mental, energy. And so I love that, just those basics, being prepared for that.
Yeah. And educating yourself ahead of time about newborn care. So there's less guesswork.
Mhm.
If your first child was medically complex, chances are you didn't get to have the routine sleep of every 3 hours. You were maybe changing a trach, you
Mm.
were maybe doing a G tube. So this is going to be a
Mm.
different experience that you need to prepare for. And so just if you're going to try breastfeeding, just getting the education done, in that 9-month process and starting it early and getting ready so that when the baby comes, it's less, researching how to do this at night. It's referring to your notes, right? Because you've already learned
Mm.
some of the basics.
Yeah.
And, just like your podcast, reaching out to other moms who have gone through it before and finding out their tips and tricks.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, I think I would just go back to what we said. And
Right.
it's more about how you, the parent, are doing and less about the age of the child. That as a parent, you can get to that moment where you're like, I can handle more.
You just got to do what you got to do and let go of the guilt.
There you go. I love it.
So I think that's a good note to end on. And I just really appreciate you coming on and helping us kind of navigate through this, because it's a tricky situation, and we love all of our children. And yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, thanks for having me. And I really appreciate it. And I'm just so happy that you had me here. So thank you. Thank you so much to Madeline for having me on your podcast. I had such a good time and just thought this was such a good conversation. I love how your followers and your listeners had questions prepared. If you guys want more episodes like this, I would love to hear from you about exactly what kind of questions you have. How would a child life specialist handle or look at something in the hospital or out of the hospital? I would love to do more conversations like this, and just totally appreciate Madeline for letting us have our conversation here today. Thanks so much for being here, guys. I just totally appreciate the listeners and the value that you bring. All right, guys, I will see you again next week. Thank you for listening to the Child Life On Call podcast. I'm your host, Katie Taylor, and you can follow us at Child Life On Call on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Please rate and review to make it easier for other families to find us. We have cute merch available at www.bonfire.com/store/Child Life On Call, and you can listen to more episodes and find resources at childlifepodcast.com.